Welcome to the Who Leads the What Identity Determines Output class. Please know that this class does build directly on the last class, real versus counterfeit identities. If you have not watched that class first, please do so. If you're watching this from the personal storytelling school, then just return to the home of the module and select that class, real versus counterfeit identities. If you're watching this on social media, then please return to the profile page and then from there find either the single video or the multiple videos if you're watching on TikTok for the real versus counterfeit identities class, because it is in that class that I discuss what identity is, what it is not, the sources of identity, the differences. So that's the type of baseline knowledge that you need, that you require for this class to really have its full value. Because in this class, it's not about redefining what identity is and is not. It's about discussing what identity inevitably produces. Because identity does not remain abstract or internal, because it's structural. Therefore, it becomes output. So this session is all about tracing the structural flow, showing how your identity determines the quality of everything you produce, from your values, your heart posture, and to your visible behavior and the atmosphere that you create. This class has one primary objective: to trace the structural flow of life, demonstrating that the who determines the quality of the what. We will cover four main areas: the flow of life, the direct relationship between your identity and your output, order versus inversion, how life operates either in the intended kingdom order or in the performance-based worldly inversion, the two governing systems. So we'll take a detailed look at the core differences between worldly and kingdom operating systems and the ultimate cost. We will close by examining how the source of your identity determines the internal cost to you via energy and the sustainability of your life. For those of you who have watched the last class, Real Identity versus Counterfeit Identities, let's do a quick recap. In that class, we clearly define what identity is and what it is not. We discuss the five structural components of identity: origin, authority, nature, worth, and calling. We examine the formation process of counterfeit identities through psychology, achievement and performance, belonging, and spiritual but not in God. We address how each of those counterfeits attempts to define the who apart from God. And then we contrasted what real identity in God looks like, how it is received, and how it meets the five structural requirements. Now, in this class, what we're going to discuss is that the who can never come from the what. You cannot build identity from work, you cannot construct identity from achievement, and you cannot secure identity through performance. The what is designed to always flow from the who. And this class explores that flow. We are now moving into section 1, the flow of life. Please remember, I am making a structural case that highlights a choice that is before you about choosing the source of your identity. And this is all fundamentally different from what the world has taught you about achievement and output. So keep that in mind as we keep going into this class. Now, I already alluded to this, that identity literally shapes how you show up in every environment and situation and how you perform what you do. It shapes your personality, reactions, behavior, mindsets, beliefs, and it impacts what you do and who you are in your relationships. Now, this slide says atmosphere, so let me explain what I mean by that. The atmosphere is the non-verbal climate you carry with you, like within you. So Two people can perform the same action or the same tasks, but the internal quality, the atmosphere that's within them will be different depending on the source of their identity. This is why the who determines the quality of the what, not just the size or the visibility of the what, but the quality and the substance. This slide introduces the original design of human life. It is the structural flow that emerges when identity is derived from God, when the human being is aligned with their origin. We are designed to move through this order. It begins with who, your identity derived from God. When identity is received from God, it establishes the foundation for everything that follows. From identity flows being. This connects directly to what we established in the last class when we discussed nature, which answers the question, what kind of being am I? Nature is the essence of the being, the structural reality of the human person as designed by God. Being is the internal state in which nature is operating. It is the condition of the inner life as that nature is expressed in real situations and relationships. From being flows producing. This is where your internal state begins generating outward expression, your personality, your values and virtues, your beliefs, and your heart posture. Producing then shapes doing. Doing is the visible activity of your life, your work, your assignments, your relationships, and the actions you take. And finally, doing produces fruit. Fruit is the evidence of the system. It is the quality of the outcomes, the atmosphere you create around you, the impact you leave on others, and the stability of what you build. So the flow is always supposed to be identity shapes being, being generates producing, producing influences doing, and doing results in fruit. This is the origin flow, the design that emerges when identity is aligned with the creator. But when identity is sourced elsewhere, this flow becomes distorted. The previous slide is not about living the perfect life. It's about having proper alignment. When identity is sourced in God, and we're living from a Christ kingdom defined who, structural alignment begins. It's not instant perfection, it's not instant maturity in Christ, but it starts a deep foundational alignment. When identity continues to be sourced outside of God, the counterfeit who, then distortion enters and remain at the source. This distortion doesn't always look or end in a dramatic collapse of someone's life. It can look successful, impressive, and productive, but the distortion always carries a cost, something we'll cover more later in the class. The point here, the core thesis, is that alignment changes everything downstream, from your internal state to your final outcomes. Section 2, Order versus Inversion, lays out the two structural systems at play, the intended sustainable order and the reverse performance-based worldly inversion. And this contrast is the structural heart of this class. The deepest mistake people make is trying to correct life at the doing level, the what level, without addressing the who, the identity level. The intended flow doesn't start with the doing, as you saw in the previous slide, the flow of life. It starts with identity. And when God defines our identity, the who, then the being stabilizes, producing becomes coherent, doing becomes consistent, and fruit becomes sustainable. This is why kingdom living is not primarily about behavior management. It is order restored. Worldly living is not simply about people doing bad things. Worldly living is a reverse structure. And in this inverted worldly structure, what you do becomes the evidence of your worth. Your worth becomes the foundation of your identity. Your identity becomes fragile because it depends on conditions, and your life becomes a performance because performance is required to keep the identity intact. This is why worldly living produces striving, because the system demands constant reinforcement. Keep doing, keep proving, keep building, keep maintaining. And the moment productivity slows, or failure happens, or approval is removed, then the identity shakes. It becomes unstable. That fragility is not a personality issue, it's a structural inversion. And all of this is a structural principle. It's not a suggestion. Whether you are aware of it or not, your life is following one of these two systems, and your life will produce fruit accordingly. This slide is a simple diagnostic lens for what I just explained, because this order has a predictable path. When the what defines the who, life becomes performance. Performance produces striving, and striving produces exhaustion. The output is fed back into the source, creating a vicious, depleting cycle. The exhaustion then shows up as anxiety and irritability, burnout, emotional numbness, relational breakdown, and this constant internal pressure that people feel. This is not because someone is weak, it's because the system is inverted and they've taken part in sourcing their identity in this inverted system. Order also has a predictable path. When the who is established properly through God, then the being stabilizes, producing becomes consistent, doing becomes sustainable, and the fruit becomes lasting. This is why the question really is not, how do I do more? The real question is, what system is governing me? What is the source of my identity? In the last section, we laid out two structural paths, order and inversion. Now in section 3, we dive deeper into two governing systems and what they mean for our lives. Just to be clear here, we are not contrasting bad people versus good people, sinful action versus righteous action. We are contrasting governing system. And a governing system determines a lot in our lives, including how identity is formed, what value is based on, what motivates effort, what success means, what failure threatens, how relationships function, and what fruit becomes normal. These are not small differences. We're addressing two completely different ways to live. Worldly living is built on the self as the source. And if the self is the source, identity must be built. If identity must be built, it must be protected. If it must be protected, it must be proven. If it must be proven, it must be maintained. This is why through worldly living, you cannot rest. Even when things are going well, the system still demands upkeep. And because autonomy is treated as authority, the person becomes their own standard, their own judge, and their own defender. This is why worldly living produces external achievement with internal instability. Kingdom living begins with a different starting point. God is the source, not the self. So identity is not built, identity is received. And when identity is received, life changes at the root. You're not proving worth, you're living from what has been given. You're not manufacturing identity, you're walking in alignment. Kingdom living, it's not laziness and it's not passivity. It is effort without striving, work without identity pressure, responsibility without internal collapse. All because your identity is anchored in origin, design, delegated authority, and that comes from relationship with God. The kingdom is not a religion, it is a government, as in a real, superior, and eternal government. And when the right government governs you, order becomes possible. Now, here in section 4, we're going to expand and drill down into each layer of the flow: being, producing, doing, and fruit, to reveal exactly how your chosen system shapes your internal world and your visible output. Being is the internal climate of your life, the condition of your inner world as you move through situations, decisions, and relationships. Four major things emerge at this layer. First is emotional tone. This is the baseline atmosphere of your inner life, the emotional climate you carry into situations, decisions, and relationships. It shapes how life is internally experienced, determining whether your inner world is characterized by tension and pressure or by steadiness and peace. The second is belief filters. These are the internal framework through which you interpret reality and evaluate choices. Beliefs establish what you hold to be true, possible, safe, valuable, and meaningful. Because of this, they shape how you understand situations, what you recognize as threat or opportunity, and what you perceive requires action or restraint. Long before a decision is made, these belief filters are already shaping how the situation is being seen. Third is heart posture. This is the orientation of your inner life, the stance of the heart that governs motives, will, and emotional response. It determines whether the heart operates defensively and self-protectively or with openness and vulnerability and humility. Fourth is power source. This is the sustaining power behind action, the underlying force that carries effort over time. It determines what actually fuels your persistent resilience and capacity to continue acting when pressure or difficulties appear. Now, notice how the governing system shapes this layer. Under the worldly system, identity is self-constructed and fragile. So the being layer becomes unstable. The emotional tone tends towards anxiety and pressure. Belief filters are shaped by comparison and self-protection. Heart posture becomes defensive and image conscious, constantly protecting identity. And the power source becomes striving because effort must be constantly maintained to reinforce the self. Under the kingdom system, identity is received and anchored in God. Because identity is no longer under threat, the internal climate stabilizes. Emotional tone becomes steady and peaceful. Belief filters operate with clarity and discernment. Heart posture becomes open and humble, and the power source flows from restful alignment with God. This is why two people can live similar lives, carry similar responsibility, and perform similar work, yet experience two completely different internal worlds. The difference is not the activity, the difference is what system is governing their being. What exists at the being layer does not remain internal. The internal climate of a person's life begins to form patterns and structures that shape how they show up in the world. This is the producing layer. Now, several things consistently emerge here. First is personality expression. This is not the same as personality in the sense of preference and temperament. Rather, it is the consistent way a person's internal world becomes visible in how they speak, in how they interact, how they respond under pressure. Second are values and virtues. Values determine what someone treats as important and worth protecting, while virtues determine the consistency of character when those values are tested. Third are mindsets and decision patterns. Now, In the being layer, we describe belief filters, the framework through which reality is interpreted. Well, over time, those beliefs produce habitual ways of thinking and deciding. They shape what a person consistently pursues, what they avoid, and how they respond when pressure or opportunity appears. Fourth is relational influence. The internal state of a person inevitably shapes the environment around them. It affects the level of trust they build, the stability they bring into a relationship, and the atmosphere they create in leadership, teamwork, and collaboration. So, again, let's compare how the governing system shaped this layer. Under the worldly system, because identity must constantly be protected and reinforced, producing becomes image driven. So personality becomes guarded and reactive, values become tied to reputation and validation, mindset prioritize comparison and self protection, and relational influence becomes transactional and unstable. Under the kingdom system, because identity is received and anchored in God, producing becomes integrated. Personality becomes grounded and secure. Values are rooted in truth rather than reputation. Mindsets become guided by wisdom and discernment. And relational influence produces stability, trust, and integrity. The differences in direction and default output are significant depending on the system governing the person. And what is produced here inevitably then shapes the next layer, which is doing the work people see. Now we move to one of the very visible layer of life, doing. This includes the work we perform, the responsibilities we carry, the leadership we exercise, and the action people can actually observe. But again, as a reminder, what we've already covered, and to make it clear, doing does not originate from the doing layer. Doing is downstream expression of everything we already covered because identity shapes being, being shapes producing, and producing shapes doing. So when you see someone's work, their leadership, behavior, you're actually seeing the output of an entire internal system. This is why two people can perform the exact same activity, yet the internal experience and the long-term impact can be completely different. So, two people can preach, lead a team, build a business, and parent their children. And from the outside, the activity may look almost identical, but the system driving the activity is not the same. Under the worldly system, work is fueled by an internal identity debt. Therefore, the person is working to prove something. They're working to prove their worth, to protect their reputation, and they're working to perform well enough to maintain the identity that they've built. Because of that, the internal experience of work carries pressure, and success becomes validation. Failure, on the other hand, becomes a threat to identity, and the work becomes the mechanism through which the self must constantly be reinforced. Under the kingdom system, work flows from established identity. The person is no longer working to become someone, they are working from who they already are in God. They operate from belonging rather than proving. They receive capacity rather than manufacturing it. And they steward assignment rather than attaching their identity to the outcome. Let me illustrate this with a simple example. Imagine two leaders running an organization. Both of them work hard, both of them care about results, and both of them lead teams and make decisions. From the outside, the work may appear equally effective, but internally, the experience is completely different. The first leader is operating from a worldly system. Their identity is tied to their performance. Every success reinforces their worth, every failure threatens it. So pressure is constant. They control tightly, they compare themselves constantly, and they struggle to trust others. because their identity is attached to the outcome. Now, the second leader is operating from a kingdom system. Their identity is already settled. Their leadership is not an attempt to prove their value. It's an opportunity to serve and to steward what God has entrusted to them. They still work hard, but their work is not fueled by identity pressure. They can make difficult decisions without insecurity. They can receive feedback without collapsing. They can lead others without needing constant validation. The activity looks somewhat similar, but the motive, the atmosphere, and the cost are completely different. And this is why doing can be productive on the outside, yet still destructive internally if it's being fueled by the wrong system. Because eventually, the cost of the system, oh, it shows up. And that leads us to the final layer, which is fruit. The final layer of the flow is fruit. Fruit is the evidence of everything upstream. Fruit is what people can see, what they experience, and the atmosphere that surrounds them when they interact with you. It shows up in several areas of life. Fruit first appears in character and behavior. Over time, the internal system governing a person becomes visible in how they constantly behave, whether their character produces patience and steadiness and self control, or whether it produces anger, insecurity, and instability. Second, fruit appears in actions and conduct. This includes the way people work and serve and respond to pressure and carry out responsibilities. The same task can be performed with integrity and generosity or with manipulation and self interest. Third, fruit appears in how a person impacts other people. Some individuals create environments where others feel threatened and controlled and diminished, while others create environments where people feel encouraged, supported, strengthened, and able to grow. And fourth, fruit appears in lasting impact of life. Worldly systems produce short term success, but leave exhaustion, damaged relationship, and instability behind them. The kingdom system produces stability, trust, and influence that continues to multiply long after the work itself is finished. This is why fruit matters. Fruit reveals the system that governs a life. Two people may perform the same actions, but the character, the relationship, and the long term impact that grows out of their lives will reveal which system is producing the fruit. We have seen so far that the source of your identity, whether it is kingdom aligned or worldly inverted, determines the entire system of your life, right down to the fruit it produces. We have examined the stable, lasting fruit of order and the unstable, performance driven fruit of inversion. But in section 5, we are going to look at another critical difference between the two systems, and that is the cost. Every system, whether aligned or inverted, requires energy and comes with a price. So the question is not, is there a cost? The question is, what kind of cost are you paying? Each system produces different fruit, and the price they require from the person living inside them is fundamentally different. Not all costs are the same. The worldly system demands lifelong identity maintenance. Identity must be built, protected, proven, and maintained, and the pressure never fully disappears because the system itself depends on the individual sustaining it. The kingdom system carries a different cost. It requires surrender of self authorship. Instead of constructing identity, the person receives identity from God. Instead of defining their own authority, they submit to the authority of the one who created them. Instead of living as the owner of their life, they live as a steward of what God has given. So, at first, the surrender can feel costly, but the outcome of the two systems moves in completely different directions. One system slowly drains life through the pressure it requires, the other restores order by returning life to the design it was created to operate within. And the next slides, we're going to look more closely at what the cost of the two system structure actually looks like in real life. As I go through the cost of worldly inversion, I want you to think about your life, the life of the people around you, and the condition of the world that we live in. Because this is going to sound intense, but I want you to put it in perspective of your life, what you've experienced, and again, what you've seen the people around you experience. All right. So identity instability carries a cost. When identity must constantly be built, protected, and maintained, the internal life never settles. Anxiety and stress become normal, comparison becomes constant, and peace becomes rare. Even success cannot quiet the pressure because the system always asks the same question. Can I maintain it? Can I maintain this success? Emotional depletion carries a cost. Constant identity pressure drains the inner life. Joy becomes difficult to sustain, rest becomes rare, and mental fatigue becomes common. People continue functioning, but internally they are exhausted. Physical health carries a cost. Chronic stress, sleep disruption, exhaustion, and declining energy become normal parts of life. The body begins carrying the pressure of the identity system. Over time, the strain can contribute to serious health problems. Relational strain carries a cost. When identity must constantly be protected, relationships become places of evaluation instead of connection. People become competitors. They become threats or tools for reinforcing worth. Trust weakens, conflicts increase, and partnership fracture. Friendships fade, families become strained, and marriages collapse under the pressure. Leadership distortion carries a cost. When identity is tied to outcomes, leadership becomes about protecting success. Control replaces trust, pressure replaces collaboration, manipulation replaces honesty. Teams become unstable, organization lose trust, influence erodes, and the cost eventually appears in long-term sustainability because some system can produce impressive short-term results, but they slowly drain the person living inside them. Let me tell you, the cost of worldly inversion does not stop with individuals. When enough people live under a system where identity must be constructed, defended, and maintained, the pressure begins to shape entire environments. The same forces that produce anxiety in individuals begin to shape institutions and cultures. Competition becomes more important than truth. Success becomes more important than integrity. Power becomes more important than stewardship. And system begin to reward the very behaviors required to maintain fragile identity. This how greed becomes normalized. When identity is tied to accumulation, people begin to believe they must constantly acquire more and more in order to secure their worth. This is how corruption becomes possible. When reputation or status must be protected, truth becomes negotiable, and integrity becomes expandable. This is how manipulation and control become common leadership tools. When outcome define identity, people begin to justify pressure, deception, and coercion to maintain results. And this is how violence and exploitation becomes possible. When identity systems are built on dominance, power, or even survival, people begin to treat others as obstacles or resources rather than human beings. Over time, the cost of the system moves beyond personal stress or relational tension, and it begins to shape the moral atmosphere of entire societies. And this is why the source of identity, of your personal identity, matters so much, because the system governing identity does not just shape individual lives, it shapes the kind of world that those people that we live in and that we build together. Worldly inversion does not simply produce tired, sick, and emotionally unstable people. When left unchecked, it has produced disordered cultures. This is the total cost of a system where identity is self constructed and needs to be constantly defended. The kingdom system also carries a cost, but the cost is radically different. The cost comes in different ways, starting with admission of origin and submission to authority. Receiving identity from God means that a person acknowledges they're not self made. Life, identity, and purpose come from God. And because God is the source, He is also the rightful authority over what flows from that life. This means surrendering the claim to define ourselves, direct ourselves, and determine ultimate meaning of life independently outside of God. Instead of acting as author of identity, a person lives as stewards to what God has given. The kingdom system also requires dependence on relationship with God. We cannot function through independence. Life in the kingdom requires listening, talking, trusting, aligning, and walking with God every moment of every day rather than relying on personal control and effort. For many people, this feels very costly because they've bought into what the modern world defines as freedom, which is complete self determination. But the freedom Jesus offers, again, radically different. Freedom in Christ is the freedom that comes from living within the design of the one who created you. This is why Jesus' invitation to the kingdom is not simply moral instruction, it's an invitation to restoration, a return to order of life where God is the source, identity is received, and human beings live as stewards of what they have been given from God. Every person is living inside one of these systems and paying a cost. So every life will either reinforce the disorder of worldly inversion and pay that cost, or participate in the restoration of God's order and pay that cost. At this point in the module, in this class, I'm hoping something is starting to be happening for you, that you just might be starting to see your life a little differently, that it's not just about what you do and who you are, it's about the source of your identity and the system that's been shaping it. I get it though. For many people, this is something that's completely new, because most of us have only been taught on how to focus on our behaviors, our goals, habits, and how to be successful in life. We're very, very rarely invited to step back and look at the structure underneath our lives. But that's what we've been doing in this module, and that's what we're going to keep doing. And we've been stepping back far enough to look at the system. And that leads to what I call awakening. And awakening is simply the moment when life begins to come into focus, and that you get to a point where you're able to start to notice the fruit your life is producing and the costs that you've been carrying. And you start to notice the atmosphere that your life creates for the people around you, and that you begin to see that those things more clearly, and that can lead to a shift. And this isn't about condemnation, it's about clarity. Because once you see the system, it's actually pretty hard to unsee it. And from this point forward, then a deeper question begins to surface. And I hope that you will start asking yourself about the system that has actually been governing your life. And that question is the beginning of awakening. Because when the system becomes visible, something else also becomes visible. And that's the possibility to live differently. And this is where the journey into transformation really begins. Let's go ahead and do a really good recap and then move on to the next class. In the previous class, we examined the source of identity. We looked at the difference between counterfeit identities, those constructed from psychology, achievement, social validation, or spiritual ideas disconnected from God, and real identity, which is received from God as the source of life. This class has shown what flows from that source. Identity does not stay internal. Identity shapes being, your internal state, and the condition of your inner life. Being shapes what you constantly produce, your personality, values, virtues, and influence. And what you produce shapes what you do, your work, relationship, leadership, and actions. And over time, those actions produce fruit. When the source of identity is counterfeit, the entire system becomes distorted. But when identity is received from God, life begins to return to alignment with the way it was originally designed to function. The who leads the what. But the structure of life does not stop here. Identity also shapes why we pursue what we pursue, and the why will eventually determine how we live and lead. And those are the areas and the layers of the system we will explore in the upcoming classes. Who owns the why? Because the why determines what you pursue, what you sacrifice for, and what ultimately shapes the direction of your life. And that is what we will explore in the next class.